no new notification. So that means maybe this recording is just all going to be one big video AI generated notes file, which is fantastic. So depending on how technology actually worked, welcome again. And now I'm going to fiddle with technology while I share my screen. Thank you, thank you. It's not that I forget how to do this, it's just that there's so many buttons to push. Okay, how'd I do? You see a thing? That's great, as long as it's not my face. Yes, thank you for the thumbs up, everyone. All right, so again, we're here to talk about belonging and well-being in museums as measured by the COVES survey. And we're really excited to be sharing these data with you. So as I go through this presentation, if you have any questions or comments specifically, you can either feel free to put them in the chat or hold on to your questions until the very end. I'm afraid if we try and do questions on any individual section, it will kind of derail my thought process, which is not normal, but I should back up a slide and say these analyses were primarily conducted by Dr. Jeremy Simon, who was briefly with the COVES team in late fall of 2023. Right before the holidays, he accepted another position, which is why he's not here to actually do this presentation for you. So I just want to make sure I get through the material and save time for questions at the end. So again, please do rely on the chat, and we'll come back to that. Alex or Allison or Sarah or Gabby, if you think there's anything super pressing and you want to jump in and interrupt me based on the chat, please go ahead and do that. So again, this is an exploratory analysis of visitors' feelings of social connection, empathy, and belongingness, welcoming during their visits. I say exploratory analyses because, as you all may know, the scales that were added to the COVES survey in July do have psychometric underpinnings and some theoretical background, but this is the first foray into data analysis from the COVES perspective and the layering of additional visitor experience measures that we've done to date. So we didn't have any research questions when initiating these analyses. So it's really to get a sense of what the measures might mean to us, how they intersect with other things that we are more familiar with, how it plays out across different subgroups. And of course, what I'm really interested to hear from all of you is how this is practically useful when we think about understanding our audiences, reporting internally, or changing the way we might approach the visitor experience. The data that I'm going to share with you come exclusively from the July 1st, 2023 to November 30th. That should be 2023. Apologies. We are not yet into November 2024, thankfully. It's from the 5 months of the start of last fiscal year, not including December. So apologies for the typo, but the good news here is the sample information is still all correct. We have more than 19,000 visitor surveys in this analysis, which really speaks to the strength of the statistical power that we're leveraging when trying to make some of these claims, as you'll see in the following slides. Unlike some of the previous analyses I may have shared, or the graphs or the posters or the presentations on the COP calls that you may have seen, the graphs, the bar charts, many of the depictions of the data actually have error bars to talk about the range and the spread of the data and sometimes the uncertainty of the precision around the measures. We're trying to do more and more of that because we know that through surveying and through random sampling, we have a good estimation of our visitors' responses, but it's not census data. And so we just want to introduce this as a way for you to interpret the data. If you're not familiar with the interquartile range, or IQR, that represents the middle 50% of the data. So the 25th percentile through the 75th percentile, with the median, which is at the middle, right? The 50th percentile, which is different than the mean. And I'll show those in the graphs as well. Both the horizontal lines and the pluses in the graphs that follow represent the mean. Again, that statistical average for any of the subgroups that we're looking at. And I'll be sure to slow down when we get to those data visualizations so everyone can take a minute to look at them. Okay, let's start off at the very top by describing the measures. So whether or not these measures are on your COVES survey right now, they are available to all of you. The two that we're going to start with come from the Humanities and Human Flourishing project, which is based out of the University of Pennsylvania. the HHF, Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, has this goal to understand, assess, and advance the role of culture in human flourishing. So they're specifically thinking about the way museums, cultural organizations play a role in the success of the flourishing of the human species right now. Through that work, and you can see the website URL on the slide, they developed a survey instrument exclusively dedicated to 5 scales: psychological distress, meaning, empathy, positive self-regard, and social connection, that is available if you go to their website. As I mentioned, they did a lot of work creating these scales, doing scale reduction, doing item response theory, and you can trust them for use in museums. That's how they were validated. COVES is only using 2 at the moment: the empathy scale and the social connection scale. If you don't know what I'm talking about just yet, the good news is you're going to learn more about it. And again, you can still add these to your COVES survey, but many of you already have them on there, so that's great. So we'll start with social connection. The scale is relatively simple. Both of the social connection and empathy scales start with the statement: please rate your agreement to the following statements from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The social connection scale, as you can see, has 5 items. I felt like I had a place in the world. I felt valued. Felt like I was part of a community. I felt connected to the people around me. I felt a deep connection to people in my life. That number at the bottom, the alpha, is the reliability coefficient, 0.92. The closer that is to 1, the better the items, quote unquote, hang together to measure a singular construct, in this case, social connection. So very high internal reliability in this case. And here is a summary of the social connection data across all sites. So with more than 2,000 surveys, visitor surveys, you can see that there's very little difference between the 5 items themselves in terms of their average response, all close to that 4 or agree level. The overall average actually is clouded in my view, but it looks like the index mean is 3.93. So, right, if you sum all those scores together, individual statements, and then divide them by the total number of responses that any singular person gave to those 5 items, their average is 3.93, very close to 4, which is basically at the agree level. The interquartile range, 3.4 to 4.4, so there's some good spread there. And you can see I felt connected to the people around me. The second statement has a smaller interquartile range than the other items. To me, this represents a little bit of stability across the measures. Again, all of those items clearly hang together, which is great. And importantly, visitors are mostly agreeing to aspects of social connection. Now, whether or not that's an intentional outcome for any of your museums, I'm not quite sure. But we know from years and years of COVES analyses that the museum experience is a highly social one, that people come to spend time together or to connect with others. So this makes a lot of sense to me. Moving right along to empathy, you can see the scale here starts in the same way. Please rate your agreement. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. There are only 4 items for the empathy scale. In working with the HHF team prior to adding these to COVES, we did try and do some additional item reduction to get them as tight as possible. In other words, to add as few new questions to the COVES survey as we possibly could, while reliably and validly measuring the constructs that we were trying to measure: social connection and empathy. So this one only has 4 items. The internal reliability is 0.83. That's still really good, not quite as high as social connection, but again, totally appropriate for our purposes. And in looking at the data, you can see that there's a little bit more variability here. That's represented in 2 ways. One, more deviance from the blue line, which represents the index mean, from the yellow bars, right? So each individual item has a little bit more play to it, if you will. And the second one is, again, that higher interquartile range for the 4th item. I was interested in trying to understand people who are different from me. So what this means is just that on the average, right, the middle 50% of respondents have a different range across the many items. The index mean, 3.61, is slightly lower than social connection. And the sample size is slightly smaller too, based on the number of institutions who have added it and the amount of data collection we've been able to do during the 5 months that we're analyzing here. So again, I'm not trying to over-interpret these in any way, because this is exploratory, and I'm very curious for all of your thoughts, questions, and comments. But we're going to take a look at how these two, and in particular, two additional measures, belonging and welcoming, interplay with some of the other COVES measures. So belonging and welcoming, as many of you have probably heard over years now, if you've been part of COVES for that long, are really important from our perspective in understanding the visitor experience. The problem that we're facing is that we don't have really good measures for either of these constructs, belonging and welcoming. And I say constructs plural because belonging and welcoming are often lumped together, like I'm doing on this slide. But in reality, they're probably measured differently, and they mean different things to different people. We've heard that from visitors in trying out different questions. We've heard that from many of you in thinking about the COVES survey. So we know that they're more complex than singular rating statements. But for now, until we get to that good work of having a fully fleshed out scale or battery of items to measure either of these, we are using placeholder measures for literally belonging and welcoming. I feel like I belong at the museum. I felt welcomed at the museum. Both of these ratings are on a 0 to 10 scale, like many of the other rating items we have on the COVES survey, because they were not validated by that strongly disagree to strongly agree scale that you saw used with the HHF measures, excuse me. So just two items, straight up. I feel like I belong at your site. Has over 2,000 responses. It has a mean, an average of 8.66. And you can see here the percentage of respondents that fell in any of those 0 to 10 rating buckets, if you will. So there's a full spread from 0 to 10. People are in all categories, but more than half of our visitors are giving a perfect rating, a 10 out of 10 for I feel like I belong. And because of that, the average is very high. That's probably not very surprising. What's maybe even more surprising is that I felt welcomed is even higher, and this has much more data behind it. So more than 12,000 responses, so that average 9.57, and more than 75% of our visitors are giving a perfect 10 out of 10. So I felt welcomed. Again, you can see that there are small fractions of percents in all of the buckets, which means there is, people are responding across the full scale range, 0 to 10. But what this tells me statistically, without over-interpreting it, is that these items don't have a whole lot of discrimination. So many people are all the way at the top that we don't have a lot of statistical power to try and pull that apart and say what was better for you in terms of your experience about helping you feel welcomed. And this, again, goes back to our need for more, better, longer measures for either welcoming and belonging, which we are working on. And I think I mentioned this in the past too, and I'm sorry I don't have the full list of folks who are on the call, but is anyone from the Science Museum of Minnesota here? And if not,
it's Marjorie. I'm here.
Yay! Marjorie, do you want to do like a 30-second plug?
Working with Boston and working with other folks around the country, we just submitted a proposal to NSF to try and do exactly what Ryan describes, to get to good measures and to build out the COVES community as a space to support the use of those measures. Cross your fingers. It's very competitive funding, so who knows if we'll get it or not. But we're very excited to imagine that future where COVES can be a center of really good measures that also work for visitors, that they can do quickly on their way out the door instead of a long 20 plus minute or 2-hour experience. So thank you everybody who contributed, which includes all of you, whether or not you knew you did, because this community inspired us.
Thanks, Marjorie. And yes, kudos to the team at SMM for getting that in. COVES is very excited to be a part of that, and all of you will play a role in one way or another, and at the very least benefit from the work should it be funded. So we're really excited to build this up. For now, we have the placeholder measures. They're good, not great, and we're going to continue treating them as placeholders until we get to that point that Marjorie described, where we have better statistical measures for these dimensions of the visitor experience. So with that introduction of empathy, social connection, welcoming, and belonging, we're now going to look at how each of these four things, for lack of a better term, interrelate to some of the other known measures or dimensions of the visitor or visit experience. And we're going to start big by looking at some of those top-level visitor experience measures that we rely on so often: Net Promoter Score and overall experience rating. So the good news is that there are lots of strong connections. And I shouldn't have phrased it that way. I don't know that there's bad news, but look, we're finding relationships between these new measures and some of the things that we've treated as important for so long. So specifically on this slide, you'll see that visitors who felt social connection, so rated themselves higher on that strongly disagree to strongly agree scale, which you can see on the vertical or y-axis here, were more likely to be promoters and to rate their experiences as outstanding. So moving from left to right, and bottom to top, you're going to see a relationship where the people who felt more strongly or agreed more strongly on that social connection measure were more likely to be in our top two categories for NPS and OER: the promoters for Net Promoter Score and the outstanding for overall experience rating. Within each one of those graphs, again, this is where you see the plus is the average for that group. The box is the interquartile range, and then the whiskers represent the dispersion around that interquartile range. Again, I'm gonna not move quickly, but I'm gonna move steadily through these slides, and we can come back to any of them for the discussion portion. Okay. So very similarly, visitors who felt empathy or rated themselves more strongly on the empathy scale during their visits were more likely to be promoters and to rate their experiences outstanding. We see a very similar pattern here as we did on the last slide, where those green boxes and the green plus signs are slightly higher across the board for Net Promoter Score and overall experience rating. So demonstrating the connection between our two top ratings for visitor experience and the relationship between, in this case, empathy and prior social connection. And this pattern continues for belonging. Visitors who felt they belonged were more likely to be promoters or rate themselves as outstanding. In fact, on the OER scale, you can see that 81% of visitors who said their visits were outstanding gave a perfect 10 out of 10, right? This notion that the belonging scale is not perfect, there's very little discrimination, but people are all the way at the top if they're in that outstanding category. And promoters are not far behind. There's a little bit more dispersion, but not much. You notice that the blue boxes on all of these scales are much bigger, top to bottom, right? There's much more spread, and they're all lower on the scale for folks who say they have a less than excellent experience or consider themselves detractors. And finally, welcoming. Visitors who felt welcome were more likely to be promoters and rate their experiences outstanding. Here, in both cases, NPS and OER, you see that interquartile range collapse into a singular 10 out of 10, which means the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, everyone was in that perfect 10 category on these welcoming scales. So strong relationships between the two. You'll notice I use the word relationships. This is more of a correlation analysis than anything else. I'm not saying one causes another, that feeling welcoming, feeling like you were welcome drives a likelihood to recommend or an outstanding experience, or the other way around, but we're seeing strong patterns of relationships in a positive direction here. So the next set of analyses, and we tried to replicate the pattern as much as possible to go over each measure with regard to a different subgroup or question of interest. We'll hit a lot of the highlights here because many of us are interested in different institution types, certain demographic characteristics, but most of the patterns, I shouldn't say are the same as that, but we'll just get into it. So here you can see that we looked at the Art Bridges cohort, Art Museum cohort, and Science Plus cohort separately. The number of institutions participating differed a lot, but there's enough survey responses, enough statistical power in each one of these to be fairly confident in some of the patterns we're seeing. And in this case, it's just that art museums and visitors to art museums in the non-Art Bridges cohort report stronger patterns of social connection, so rating themselves higher on that social connection scale. This is evidenced in the yellow bar in the middle with the box that's slightly higher and the yellow line that goes all the way across, which is the average. So the average scale average is over 4, whereas for Art Bridges museums and science centers, it's under 4, and the median is also slightly higher. In contrast to that, Science Center visitors report feeling slightly less welcome. Now, this one's hard for me too, only because for both art bridges and art museums, we see that interquartile range collapse all the way at the top, which is great. I mean, more than 75% of our visitors are all the way at the top. And that's only slightly less true for science centers. There's slightly more dispersion in a downward manner. So that brings both the average and the median down. But these differences are very small, and we still have a lot of digging to do when it comes to what welcoming means. But one of the aspects of the visitor themselves or the visiting group themselves that we know can drive a lot of these patterns is their affiliation or relationship with the museum, which we use as a proxy for membership, or we use membership as a proxy for. Unsurprising to me, probably unsurprising to many of you, members have stronger connections with almost all of these measures, meaning compared to their non-member peers at any museum that's asking these things, members were more likely to feel social connection. As you can see here in the left, the yellow on the left are the members. Members were more likely to feel a greater sense of belonging, the yellow on the left. And then members and non-members do not differ in reported empathy. But members report feeling slightly more welcome during their visits as well. So a lot of these interpretations for me are the same when I'm looking at the patterns or the percentages of visitors who are putting themselves in that topmost category. And again, the collapsing of the interquartile range at the very top of the scales. We also looked at reported race and ethnicity. And I will admit that this one to me is the messiest, probably because of the way we chose to analyze it, where we took the single race categories and isolated them. And what you just see here is that there are statistical differences between visitors who report being in different racial or ethnic categories. But there's no distinct pattern that jumps out at me. It is worth noting that the yellow is only representative of visitors who did not say or didn't identify a race or ethnic category. It's not meant to pull that out as higher or lower, better or worse, or anything like that. So you can see that there is some variation both in the size of the interquartile range and then where those plus signs are, which again is the mean for the group on the scale, slightly higher and lower across the board. And the same thing is true for the empathy scale. So there are statistical differences between visitors reporting different race or ethnic identities. The yellow here again is just visitors who did not identify or didn't say what their race or ethnic identity was. But there is variation among those different groups. And again, I'm happy to go back to these slides, and these will be posted along with the YouTube video. The same thing is true of sense of belonging, right? There's differences, but you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, based on the data that we've already looked at in this presentation, that the top of the interquartile range for all visitor groups is at 10. So the top of the scale of for belonging. There's just more downward movement in a couple of the categories based on, again, the length of the box, which is the interquartile range, and then where the plus is, which is the mean or the average. Specifically, in this case, I see the groups that choose to self-describe having a larger interquartile range, more spread down, more downward dispersion on the scale, and a lower plus or a lower mean on average compared to other groups. Feelings of welcoming, welcomed during visits also varied significantly by race. My interpretation is largely the same, except I'll default to what I've said in other sections, which is some of these groups don't even have an interquartile range that extends beyond 10 because they're loading so highly on the scales. So are there differences here, or do we just not have measures that are sensitive enough to really get at what we mean by welcoming and people at the top end of that scale? Okay, there's a few more subgroups that I wanted to cover on these scales before we open it up to conversation and question. We did look at visitors' reported disability status, if they said they have a permanent or temporary self-identified disability. And the only thing that we were able to see was that visitors who prefer not to share their disability status felt less welcome. All of the other measures, empathy, social connection, and belonging, did not vary by visitors' reported disability status in this area. And again, because of this scale, the differences are minimal and at the very high end. And I think this is the last section where we looked at gender identity. In this case, it's LGBT plus visitors. So we actually didn't look at, this is the LGBT plus question. I'm not sure what I want to say beyond that, except that there are a lot of nuances here. So what's important to pull out, and Allison and Alex, because we all talked about this at the beginning, it would be great if you could chime in as necessary, or if you feel I'm missing anything. But visitors who report to be LGBT plus felt slightly more social connection than those who do not identify, who report being unsure or questioning or prefer not to say. This pattern continues for the empathy scale. Visitors who report identifying as LGBT plus are higher on the empathy scale than those who do not identify as LGBT plus, are unsure or questioning, or prefer not to say. And the pattern gets slightly more complicated when we look at the belonging scale, where visitors who said yes or no to the LGBT plus question identified or rated themselves as having slightly more belonging than those who reported being unsure or questioning or prefer not to say about their identity. And finally, visitors who prefer not to share their gender identity reported feeling less welcome than those who reported identifying as LGBT plus, not identifying as LGBT plus, or being unsure or questioning. So that's more information than I would give in a report or on a poster, but we're also trying to be fully transparent about the analyses and where we don't find significance or differences in the groups that we do look at for part of these patterns of association. So again, there's no, I didn't write an executive summary for any of these sections, let alone the entire share out, but I am very curious if you'd like me to go back to any specific slides, or if I should just stop screen sharing and we can open it up to some comments and questions. And Sarah, Allison, Alex, anybody have chat? Is there anything in the chat?
Just one question about children's museums, which are typically included in the science museum cohort. Although I'll add a reminder out loud that, again, that not every museum has chosen to add these questions to their survey. So your museum might not necessarily be represented here, but that is also something that could be changed. We can add these questions to surveys in general if people are interested and you don't have to have them.
I had a question. If you want to go back to like the MPS OER slides and with some of the social connection or empathy scales. And this is just like, way to go, y'all. This is really exciting. This is like something that I have been very excited about for a while. And even seeing this data come in on my own survey, I'm like, oh, I wonder how I can analyze this. So like two questions, I guess. And one is just general, like, will you be sharing how you created any of these analyses that we might do it individually for our own site? I would be really interested in that, and maybe others would too. And then more specific to just like, I never thought box and whisker plots would just bring me so much joy for half an hour. Like, who knew? But since maybe I need a little education here, if you could help me. When I think about like this NPS on the left and seeing how those boxes sort of are near each other. So is it correct in thinking like some of the people who would be a detractor are like kind of at the same range as some of people rating it in the passive range? And so like they might be at the same level of like social connection, just because like those boxes are right on the same like part of the line. Like, how do those boxes relate to each other? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can. And so just to the first point, for any of you who are really passionate about this, like Julie, and get joy from box and whisker plots, I'm happy to share the R code that Jeremy developed for this. There's a lot of stuff that is universally applicable across the raw data files, so you should be able to easily interpret it if you're an R user. I don't have that same syntax for SPSS if you're an SPSS user, and doing something like this in Excel would be not hard, but I just don't have anything prepared because it's not script oriented. So definitely reach out to me if this is something you're interested in doing on your own. But great question, Julie, about the relationship between the kind of the boxes that look like they would overlap if we put them on the same vertical axis. In this case, Jeremy chose to use the interquartile range as quote unquote error bars. Now, the standard error of the mean, which is more often used to represent the error around a point estimate, so in this case, the plus sign, which is the average, right, is more typical. So I'll scale that all the way back. If I were to do this in a very simple fashion, I might just take the average and use those in bars, right? And so you'd see a blue bar that goes up to the plus sign here, and you'd see a yellow bar that goes up to the plus sign here, and a green bar that goes up to the plus sign there, right? And then we're just saying those averages are different. But then we say, wait, the group sizes are different, and there's a whole lot of things that go into there. So what's the error around that top of the bar, or that average? In this case, we're using the interquartile range. So your interpretation of the blue and yellow is correct, acknowledging that that's not the typical error bar that you see. It is the full interquartile range, representing the 25th percentile and up to the 75th percentile of all respondents in that category. So when I look at the blue and yellow on the left for NPS, the 75th percentile towards the top, right, for detractors on the social connection scale is about at the 50th percentile of the passives, right, represented by the full line across that box of the box and whisker plot. So all 50% for the detractors fit in that 25th to 50th percentile for the passives. So to me, that says, yes, they're at that same range, but another way of saying that is the medians are very different. The median for the detractor, it's hard to see on this slide, but it's all the way at the bottom of the box. It's like this double blue line here. And so, you know, the top 50% of the passives are in the same top 25% of the detractors. So it's nuanced depending on the interpretation you are trying to make, or like what you're trying to pull out of it. But again, the averages are different across all three groups. The medians are different across all three groups, but there is overlap, which makes a lot of sense. But it stacks in a way that is logical based on this sequence. The detractor box fits in the bottom half of the yellow box. The yellow box, right, this 50th percentile to the 75th percentile fits in the bottom half of the interquartile range for the promoters. So it's literally like a stacking mechanism that we see. As you move from detractor to passive to promoter, you get progressively higher on the social connection scale. That's true across median and mean. Now, that is an artifact of the data, meaning this would change with a different sample. If we were to change the like the institutional cohort that we were looking at, I can't promise that that same pattern would be true, but across all sites with the data that we have for the 5 months that we analyzed, it seems to be true across all measures in that same pattern, NPS and OER, kind of getting progressively higher from median and mean.
Thank you.
Great question. Love it. Want more? And if the questions are not slide dependent, if this is more theoretical in nature, or questions about the, you know, the questions themselves, scales, or your survey, I can stop screen sharing and we can see more people.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Beth.
So I've kind of more annoying like methodology question. So we've got the 0 to 10 scale, where it's a little easier to think of calculating means and medians, right?
Yeah.
The mean of a 0 to 10 is 5. And even though they're discrete, right, people can't choose in between, it's, you know, a little easier. But we're comparing it to a 5-point categorical Likert scale, which are really discrete,
Yep.
not continuous variable. And we're not starting that scale also at 0.
Sure.
The minimum on that scale is 1, and the minimum on the welcome and belonging ones, right, are 0. So, for example, when you have the bar charts, if you're strongly disagree, you're not at the bottom of the y-axis. You have 1. You've earned something, and I realize that gives it so that a nice mean is 3 versus or is 2.5 versus, you know, if you did it 0 to 4. So I'm just curious how those kind of leaps might in fact affect the interpretation and analysis, both just with that kind of Likert scale move to numeric, and then maybe comparing the results of the questions that have 2 different scales.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we chose to display social connection and empathy together in this style. So you can see, you know, the categorical axis is labeled with the response option: strongly disagree, agree, neither, agree, strongly. So, right. And even though index mean equals 3.61, we've already explained the scale is 1 to 5, as you've already pointed out. The visual is different for this. We're not presenting it in the same style because you can now see percentage loadings for every single one of those 0 to 10 options. I agree, and this is probably not the best place for us to debate the difference between the Likert, continuous, ordinal, right? We chose to treat, so for those of you who are not as nerdy as me and Beth and get into this, strongly disagree isn't a number, and the difference between strongly disagree and disagree is not possibly the same as the difference between disagree and neither for many respondents, whereas the difference between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 for almost all people when responding to a survey is exactly the same, right? It's a 1 unit integer difference. So yes, it was a choice, an analytical choice that we made to treat these scales as continuous for the sake of producing a mean, again, as an exploratory pattern. Chi-square test can be more finicky, you know, seeing a difference, but which category you're seeing a difference in, especially when you're comparing it to another categorical piece like NPS and OER, right? Buckets for LTE, excellent and outstanding. I'm happy to revisit this at any time or consider the pros and cons of different approaches. But again, it's the same reason why, even though we're doing box and whisker plots here, you can see I'm not trying to compare the belonging average to the empathy average. They're on different scales. The numbers mean different things. I totally get that. And even if we were to normalize them, I'm not sure what we'd be saying just yet. And I also want to be quick to point out, and I'm going to stop sharing here, and I can always start again. I want to be quick to point out that, as I mentioned in the second or third slide, like these are exploratory, and I'm still not fully sure. But we definitely didn't have a research question that said, I expect this, right? The null hypothesis is that all institution types will have the same belonging average, or, right, there will be no statistical differences between NPS categories and the empathy scale. We didn't approach it that way. We just kind of said, what are the data showing right now, and what interpretations can we start making? And more importantly, how does that lead this community into question formation, into challenging assumptions, or into saying, I want to add this to my survey, or this is not helpful for me on my survey? Because I don't have the answers to those questions either.
Thanks, Ryan. No need to go further. I think it was actually a really good way of dealing with the challenge of the categorical by showing the box and whisker. I think that helps give a little more context to what a mean means for categories.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
And it just so happens I'm wearing my original COVES shirt in case people don't remember. Right? Can you read it? It's good. It's good. It is good. That was the best one we did, I think, so far. Yes, mean is just an average. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from more of you who are either asking this question and maybe how you're starting to use it internally or what you started doing with it. Or for those of you who are not asking these questions, like, what does it bring to mind? Are you really eager to put it on your survey? Are you still curious about how others are going to use it? I'd love to hear more.
I've got a question.
Mhm.
And it requires maybe the slides again. I was looking at the social connection slide way at the beginning when you first started talking real data. And getting there. This one, yes. I noticed in our own data, when we first were able to kind of see it, I noticed that I felt connected to the people around me was slightly lower than the other ones. And I'm also seeing that interquartile range is also smaller. And so assuming that's meaning it's all kind of hanging together a little bit closer in terms of people are all rating it more similarly. But I don't know, I just had some kind of initial hunches about why that might be, that one is a little different than its friends. And I'm curious if you guys have hunches too.
Personally, I don't. There's a trick here too, which is each of these items as a standalone measure means something, as I think you're about to get into, right? Like making a hunch just on this singular item descriptive. But in theory, the way I've been treating it at the high level so that I don't drive myself crazy is just looking at scale performance overall. So all 5 questions, what's the average? What's the deviance between all 5 in terms of their performance to talk about social connection, not about how I felt connected to the people around me. So I'd love to hear what you've thought about so far.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about this, I think that's the one that's maybe the most concrete of like, I'm literally looking around me at the museum, and it could be interpreted as the people that you're visiting with, or it could be literally other visitors. And so I think that might be, I don't know, it's actually more confusing to me that it would have a smaller range. So I don't know. I would think people are thinking about it very 2 ways potentially, but I don't know. Just curious.
No, I mean, it's a great point. Despite what I said earlier about, we know from our motivation question that people come for largely social experiences. There's a little bit of ambiguity in that statement. Do I feel connected to the visiting groups that I'm not a part of today? My own group? People around me in general? It can be very different. Whereas most of the other statements, right? I felt like I was part of a community. Community is broader. Deep connection to people in my life, at the museum or not. I felt like I had a place in the world, very existential. I felt valued, right? So I think there's some different interpretations of each of those, which again is why I'm glad we're in the arena of administering previously tested and validated scales for museum settings rather than developing them, because we would debate this one a lot. Thank you, Julie, for sharing the original summary about developing these scales. So for those of you who want more information, the write-up and the other scales that are not included on COVES, you can see in the chat, there's a URL that redirects there. And Beth's asking, do you ever look at visitors who come on their own? So that's a really interesting question. Yeah, for social connection, because there is no visiting group. That's fascinating. I have not looked at groups of 1 in these data just yet, but I encourage you to, and let me know what you find. So Amy, you're noting that the social connection has overlap with some of what we found in our belonging work as well. Are you able to come off mute and say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't know if you can pull up the slides again. Some of those statements from the slides that thinking about and sorry, I don't have it right in front of me at the moment. But when we looked at, our definition of belonging from our study, which we shared with all of you in a previous COVES COP call, is that part of people that we heard of part of feeling belonging was feeling this connection to the people that they came with, as well as feeling like they were part of this, connection with the museum itself and with other visitors. So I think this, there's overlap with this scale with some of what we were seeing of how people described feeling a sense of belonging in the museum. So some of what this is measuring some of how people feel belonging in a museum setting as well.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know for now, since we don't have a more well-developed measure of belonging, that this is capturing some of that.
Yeah.
I don't have anything revolutionary to share. Julie, were you gonna jump on? No?
No.
Since it's quite quiet for questions, I dare to ask one. I'm a newbie to all this process. I feel like you guys on another level. But I want to know, because our museum is not implementing these questions yet. I don't know the reason for that, but I'm going to ask because answers seem like there's a lot of value in these questions. For the museums who are implementing them, like when did you decide that it was time? Because I know that sometimes people say like, oh, there's a lot of questions, and if I additionally have to this one's like, when did you decide that it was time to care about this and not about other things, like maybe other concerns have been covered, or how did you make that choice?
So I won't speak for everyone, but there may be a simple question, a simple response to this, which is we made the connection with the Human Flourishing Project in the spring of last year and pushed to get it available for the survey as an optional question by July 1st. So that's when all museums were kind of notified that that the skills were available. Many chose to do it right then, but as I mentioned on this call, if you don't have it and you're interested, we can add it at any time. But to all of you who currently ask it, I'm actually not sure you added it on July 1st or then. So if you added it later, please chime in.
We added it as soon as we could, because I was just, my institution is really focused on social connection and has even used like that type of framing with some past projects. And now we talk about other words like wellness and well-being as well. But it was just important. Seeing this today helps though, because like I started getting data in mid last year, and I've just been like, yep, those are the proportions of responses, but wasn't quite sure how I was going to visualize it from sort of like, this is what we saw in 23, or even what types of analysis would be useful. And now this is making me think more about like, oh, we don't ask about every single space in our museum, but with the temporary exhibitions and like to what extent do they foster dialogue? Dialogue is like core to what my museum is, and probably many other art museums here are talking about, and that aspect of social connection is more obvious even in the wording of the items. So I think that's another way that I'm going to look at it, and will be more interesting over time too, because temporary exhibitions don't happen like every day. They're like 2 big ones a year. So I think that might be a more like site specific interest of mine, but was sparked by today.
Thanks, Julie. And Ryan, of course.
it's easy. I do think most of the institutions that are asking that right now did choose to add it at the beginning of the fiscal year in July. So I'm not sure people have said now is the time to start focusing on it. We haven't really had it available for long enough for that pattern of survey refinement to play out yet. Any last questions as we get close to the top of the hour? If not, I want to thank you all for being here and for going down this exploratory analysis road with us and asking some really good questions. Again, this will be available on YouTube if you want to share it with your colleagues. If you have any follow-up questions, as Julie did, about like the syntax or code or ideas for visualizing the data, please do reach out to the COVES team. We'd be happy to chat it through. Again, we're still learning about this and what it means. But I'm really excited about the connections with the overall experience. And I think it's really important that there are subgroup differences, because this means that the role that empathy and social connection and belonging play in our museums is something we should pay attention to. So thanks again. And just at the tail end, I want to make a plug for our February Community of Practice webinar, where we're going to have another presentation, but it's on the soft skills of data collection. So regardless of your level of experience with COVES or data collection itself, I'm really excited to hear what Andy from Science Center of Iowa has to say and how that can help us all think about improving our approach and our connection with visitors when we're in the survey process. I think this is something that a lot of people can benefit from. So we look forward to seeing you on February 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific for another good community of practice call. Thanks all. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.